So we're going to make a start. We're going to start on time. Do come in, please. So, welcome everybody, especially if you're new to the Buddhist Centre. If you haven't been here before, you're very, very welcome. Welcome to the Parliamentary Candidates Evening. And especially a warm welcome to our four Parliamentary candidates. Thank you very much for coming. And we're going to start right now because we want to make very much the most of this evening. My name is Priyananda. That's my Buddhist name. I'm involved in the Cambridge Buddhist Centre, and I've been organising this evening. So we're going to be having this in the year of the 20th anniversary of the, the 200th anniversary of the Festival Theatre. We don't know that in the history of the theatre in the last 200 years whether there was a Hustings. I think there probably was, but this is the first time that the Cambridge Buddhist Centre at least has organised a Hustings here. So just a few items of housekeeping before we start. First of all, toilets. There are, as you might have already found out, there are toilets in the front of the building in the house, quite clearly signposted. And there are toilets through this door, or you can get through it from that door up there, on the side, just on this side here. The fire exits are fairly clearly marked here and here. And we have to point out the fire marshals. So that's, can they put up their hands at least? Yes, so that's the city, Oscar, and Imogen. Yes, okay. And also, please turn off your phones. Some people who attend this centre have electrical sensitivity, so we'd really appreciate if you could either turn off your phone or put it on flight mode. Okay. So possibly no tweeting in the next hour and a half. Okay, I just want to say something about the schedule for this evening. We're going to be having, the first part is going to be short introductions from our candidates. They're going to be saying, introducing themselves and their policies. And in the second part, we're going to have the main part of the evening, questions, formal questions from the people here to the candidates. And if we get time, we'll have a period for open questions from the floor. I hope during the questions we can have some interaction also from the whole audience. I do have to say, I invited all the candidates back in the autumn. It's been quite a long process to get here. But I also invited Patrick O'Flynn of the UK Independence Party, and he declined. I'm obliged to tell you that. It seems also that every Hustings chairperson tries to channel Jonathan Dimbleby. I'll do my best, but at the very least I will be formally chairing this evening, and I'm going to be particularly ensuring that each of the candidates gets an opportunity to speak to the issue and as timed as I possibly can be. And we will rotate the questions on a random rotational basis. And also I ask that the candidates and the audience respect the protocol of having a chair. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. But perhaps even more importantly, I'd ask people to bring to mind the fact that we're having these hustings in a Buddhist centre. And in this particular location, this particular place, the theatre, which has been dedicated over more than 10 years to the development of tranquility, compassion, peace of mind. And so we want to have the hustings in line with those sorts of qualities. And we hope the discussion can be as little polarised as possible and as more like a discussion than an argument. But I'm sure the candidates will do their best to have that sort of discussion. And also, even more importantly, this is an opportunity for you to meet the candidates. I'm going to, as much as I can, step out of the way, and they can speak, and you can custom issues. Okay, so right over to our first part, and I'm going to call on Shamali. I'm going to actually time you strictly. I'll just give you a little ring if I need to after 3 minutes. So I'll ask Shamali Fernando of the Conservative Party to speak.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for inviting us here. It's interesting that you commented on how we should behave. Normally when you go to a hustings, you're quite fired up, you're ready with your points and your ammunition, and actually stepping into this room, there is something that makes you feel very serene and calm. So I hope that that continues. Actually, it's a very lovely feeling. Some of you will know that I am, in fact, a Buddhist, so it's very nice that you've managed to arrange these hustings for us. I am 36 years old. I have been a barrister for the last 12 years of my life, and I've represented people from all walks of life, those facing jail, the loss of their job, the loss of their home, the collapse of their business. And I am also a policy advisor to set up an international court for the environment. And the other hat I wear is that I am an attorney, licensed attorney for the State Bar of New York. I first entered politics in 1983. I was a child, propped up with a family photograph for the candidate. My father contested a parliamentary seat. And then in 1987, I was out there on the campaign trail, and I got this real buzz from being in a general election campaign trail. And then I came to Cambridge when I was 18 to study an A-level in politics. And that's when, through my studying, I realised that actually it wasn't just campaigning. One day, I wanted to actually play a frontline part in politics. And it's so nice to be back in Cambridge, seeking your vote to become the MP for this city. Three of my main visions for Cambridge: improving quality of life, so taking care of those who need our support the most through the welfare benefit system, looking after our pensioners and those who contributed to society, and looking after families and creating stable societies. Creating job opportunities for people, whether that be through apprenticeships. Under this government, we've managed to achieve 2.2 million apprenticeships, and we plan to achieve 3 million under the next government. Giving people the right skills and equipping our workforce of tomorrow, because jobs aren't just going to be in Cambridge. We'll get our children, I haven't got children, but our children generally should be equipped to approach the global jobs market. So learning languages, I think, is very important. Finally, my greatest goal for Cambridge is to make Cambridge the global benchmark for a fairer, greener and more sustainable society. And I believe we can do it because of the fact that Cambridge's reputation on the global stage, we are the leading seat for education in the world. In addition to which, we have pioneers in science, technology, innovation and research. And this is a city of bright minds. And I think through our models, there are some things that we still need to get right here, but through our models, we can really champion the bigger global issues of the day, such as tackling climate change and global child poverty. It's an ambitious programme, but I hope that you will come with me on that journey. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
So I'll ask now Julia Robert of the Democrat Party to speak for 3 minutes. Yes, so thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Fernando, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to see so many familiar faces. I always start these things by pointing out the fact that I grew up in Cambridge. I spent most of my life here. There is one person in the audience who apparently I soaked with a garden hose when I was 6. And I'd like to formally apologise. I won't say who it was. It's one of the hazards of standing in Parliament in the place that you grew up. But it's been a great honour and a privilege. Something which actually most politicians don't do is to represent their home. And to represent Cambridge and the values of people here in Cambridge. And I think those values are quite important. My values are very dear to me. It's what got me into politics. So I'm a liberal. My aim is to try to empower people to be who they can be. I don't mind people being different, that's fine. I want to support people in what they can be. I'm an environmentalist. I care passionately about that. We have to tackle climate change. That's why I fought so hard to see an increase in renewables, and also fought very hard against fracking. We have to try to get the right balance to save our planet and support biodiversity and much more. I'm also at heart an internationalist. I'm a huge supporter of the European Union, which could be fixed, and the United Nations, which could also be fixed. I'm a big supporter of our commitment to the rest of the world. And so, for example, I was very proud to co-sponsor a piece of legislation writing into law the fact that we as a country will give 0.7% of our income to international development aid. That's a target we set as a country in 1970, but we never did it until a couple of years ago. I'm proud we'll now keep doing it. I'm also absolutely committed to social justice, and so I fought to lift poorly paid people up out of income tax. Why should somebody earning as little as £10,000 a year have to pay £700 of that in income tax? They need that money. We should go further than that. We should also get more people onto the living wage. I've tackled other issues, such as revenge evictions, where people can be forced out of their homes because they dare to complain. So that's the values, but I've also stood up for Cambridge as a city. I've got more money for our schools. For decades we've been underfunded, and last week we were the lowest funded in the entire country. This week we have £23.2 million extra, and thanks to those of you here who helped in that campaign, which will start to give more of an opportunity for our children. I've got more money coming in for the NHS, a bit over 20 million coming in this month, with a particular focus on mental health, something which has been neglected for ages, something I have championed. More support for affordable housing, so people have somewhere they can afford to be. For sustainable transport, so that people can get around by foot, by bike, by bus, by train, whatever it might be. And I've stood up for those values, even where it's meant rebelling against the government and my party. So I voted against military intervention in Syria and in Iraq. I voted against the Lansley health reforms at the crucial third reading. I voted against a tuition fee rise. And I voted to say that we should scrap Trident as a nuclear deterrent we don't want or need. So I think I have a track record of standing up for Cambridge, for my home, and for standing up for Cambridge's values. And I hope you'll want to see more of that over the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hello, it's great to be here this evening. I think that we live in many ways in a world that is a wonderful place and a better place than it used to be. But I also believe passionately that we live in a world that is in deep crisis and subject to a malaise, a whole set of malaises. We are facing a profound crisis of democratic representation. Our democracy is being hollowed out and increasingly bought by corporations. We're facing a profound crisis of inequality. Ever-rising levels of inequality in this country and around the world are simply unacceptable and disastrous in so many ways, which I hope we'll talk about this evening. We are facing a profound ecological crisis. I'm sure I don't need to tell you about that, but it's something that sometimes I think we try to put to the back of our minds because it's so huge and so terrifying and so difficult, this vast, vast supertanker to turn around. And I think we are facing a spiritual crisis. I think we're in the grip of a spiritual crisis. I don't believe it's enough to just do politics in a kind of business as usual fashion. I think we have to look to the deeper roots of our problems. To tell you a tiny bit about myself in connection with that. So I've been involved since the 1980s in Quakerism, and I'm familiar through Quakerism with peace and with the importance of peace, and with meditation, including group meditation. In 2001, in the midst of a profound personal crisis, and in the midst of a long period of time I spent in India and Nepal, I came to Buddhism, and I think that Buddhism has things that are of relevance to the world today, to the crises, to the malaise that I've just been outlining. I've written about this to some extent in my academic work, which any of you who are interested might want to peruse or Google after this event, but very, very briefly, what I believe is that the nub of this spiritual crisis has to do with a fantasy of separation, of us being separate from each other, with a fantasy of individualism which is pushed forward and expanded all the time through our growthist society and through the power of advertising. And I think that we need to look more deeply into ourselves and into each other if we are actually going to find a way of overcoming these interconnected crises that we face. We have to think ecologically in the biggest sense of that word. So for me, politics is very much a matter of doing things day by day, bread and butter. It's also a matter of principles, and it's also a matter of deep underlying beliefs. And one of the reasons why I'm passionately involved in politics is that I want a better future for everybody. But behind that reason is that I think that this everybody, that we're not so separate from each other as we think or fantasize that we are. And Buddhism is one of the routes that I found towards understanding that. I hope to share a little more with you about this evening, and I'm very interested to hear your questions. This is a very important hustings for me. Thank you.
So on to Daniel Fleischner, and who is the Labour Party candidate.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. I'm Daniel Fleischner, I'm Labour's candidate for Cambridge, and I'm delighted to be here. And I was going to say a little bit about myself first, because there's some people I don't recognise here tonight. And I came to Cambridge as an undergraduate to come to King's in 1976. My mother was absolutely delighted because her father had been an agricultural worker in Shepworth, and he was one of those working class people who never got a chance. He was self-taught, and he actually used to sit outside King's, and she couldn't ever imagine, I don't think, that a member of our family would come to a university like Cambridge. And he, I think, would be stunned to think that his grandson would now have the potential to actually represent this great city. So for me, it's partly personal. I joined and got involved in politics actually after 3 years, and some of you will know that 1979 was an interesting year politically. And I joined the Labour Party because I was living in Comberton, some of you know, in farm cottages opposite the church there. And a guy came and knocked on the door. He looks a bit like Michael Foot actually, he wasn't Michael Foot. He had long flowing hair. He knocked on the door and he said, Mr. Worbycats. And I said, well, I've got quite a funny name, but it's not that one. And he looked kind of crestfallen. And this must have been a 1 in a million chance 3 months after Margaret Thatcher had been elected. He said, well, I was hoping that Mr. Worbycats had applied to join the Labour Party. I say it took quite a long time for the messages to get through and everything. And it must have been a 1 in a million chance. And I said, oh, well, he's moved, but I'll join. And so it began. And through a long process, a few years later, I actually got more involved when I went to a meeting in Suffolk, when just after the mines strike, and there was a Labour MP there who'd come to speak to us, and she was very critical of the miners, basically having lost. And I was just furious, and I sort of jumped to my feet, and I'd never really spoken in a public meeting before, and I just couldn't believe what she was saying. And I sort of sat down and people applauded, and I suddenly thought, crikey, I didn't know I could do that. And so it started in that kind of, that way, and all my life, politically, I suppose what motivated me is social justice. And I have to say that I hear Julian's account of Cambridge, and I see a very different Cambridge. I see a very divided city. What I see is lots of people struggling on 0 hours contracts at the moment. Virtually everywhere I go, I come across people on 0 hours contracts, particularly young people. I see people on low pay. I see people who can't afford to find housing. And all those things make me feel that something's got to change. And I think the election in a few weeks' time is a really, really key moment. Some of you, I'm looking around at the age profile, will remember 83, 87, 92, what it's like to wake up after having some hope of political change, and then to know, and with a fixed term of now, 5 years isn't going to change for 5 years. So there's a big choice. Most of the things I want to talk about are in the questions that follow, so I'll leave my comments to there. But this is a massive choice, huge attention on Cambridge, because this is one of the seats that will determine the outcome of the election. Really look forward to talking to you over the next hour and a half, and hope that get the chance to know you better in the months and years ahead. Thank you very much.
So we'll move straight into the questions. I just want to ask people who are asking the questions to speak very loudly, as loudly as you can and as clearly as you can. And also, Richard Taylor is actually doing a little film for us, which will go up on YouTube, and I'm sure we'll connect to it through the Buddhist Centre website of the proceedings. So that's good. Okay, so we're on to our first question, and this comes from John Turner. I just want to say, we started with this question, which is really a very general question on community, and I think all of our candidates have touched on it and their particular connections with Cambridge. So Well, as John will explain, I think this is an important area and to do with the creation of community. So, Jonathan.
So, for members of our Buddhist movement, community is a very important part of our lives. Given the increasingly fractured society in Britain, what steps would the candidates take to build community in Cambridge?
So, I also just would say that actually there's an issue here to do with you know, how much the government is involved, how much voluntary sector and faith communities are involved. So, Chamali.
Thank you very much, John, for that question. You'll remember at the last election, the Conservatives spoke a lot about the big society, and we don't talk about it much now because the press were quite scathing of our ambition in terms of the big society. But we have delivered under this government the Localism Act, which gives communities right to bid on properties, communities right to challenge developments that are going on. So we are empowering communities through some of our policies. We've also introduced free schools, where people within the community who believe that they have the skills and the ability to run a school can step forward. There are lots of projects where we can join together, and actually that's what the big society is about. It's about social action, volunteering, playing your part, and working together with government, with civic society, and with individuals in order to create a better society. Cambridge actually has a vibrant community society because we have about 30 hustings listed in the diary, organised by different campaign groups, extremely well attended, and those are little communities in themselves. And I grew up in Leicester, and I've lived in Cambridge, and I've lived in London. And what I find from Leicester, which is described as this multicultural, multi-ethnic city, is whilst there were communities from different ethnic backgrounds, people were segregated into their little communities, either due to language or just familiarity. And there was a lack of social cohesion. And that's something that in London is very different. It's a different type of community, everyone's very focused on their own lives, but you get people moving together perhaps in terms of age group. Cambridge, what I feel and what I notice, there is a greater and more flourishing sense of community, and I would like to replicate that. This is where I say Cambridge has some of the solutions for Great Britain. When I first met David Cameron, I said to him, you should visit Leicester, because it's a microcosm of everything that's gone wrong in Great Britain. It struggles with huge inequalities between the rich and the poor, between schools that are extremely challenged and those schools that get a lot of funding. I also believe in sustainability leadership. That's where, if you're running an organisation, and you run a fantastic organisation, unless you help those around you, are you really running a good organisation? Take a headmaster of a school which has the brightest pupils in the country, but if those around in that locality are not benefiting from that education, then we have failed. Yesterday, a few of us went to Macmillan to talk about some of the new projects that they are bringing in for their patients. And they mentioned health walking and how they felt that this was a great way of getting patients who were recently diagnosed with cancer together, just to make them feel that they weren't alone. And that, I thought, was very powerful, and it's something walking is good for your health anyway, and it's such a nice idea. And I think there are lots of projects we can look at that go on in Cambridge already, that we can model out to other parts of the country, but also that we can tell people about. So the internet is a great resource for this, and I would like to see more community groups letting other community groups from different sectors know about their work and what they do. Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting question and raises so many related things. Some of you will remember some of the issues about HMOs, house of multiple occupancy, in the Buddhist context, which I got somewhat involved in, trying to explain that if you have a number of Buddhists living together, You don't necessarily have to apply the full rules about HMOs that would apply for a classic HMO of a large number of unrelated people, because it is much more of a community. I see the nods from the people who remember that particular series of conversations over many years. And I think there is a lack of understanding of what a community is and how it can work. And I think this is really important. We'll do a question later, I think, about economics, what we think of the current economic model. I'll say a bit more about this then. But I'm quite interested in the idea that there should be an alternative, that we should look much more at well-being as what we aspire to, rather than simply economic growth. And there's now an increasing amount of research and evidence around this, I should confess. My mother, who I think some of you know, is an academic who works on well-being, on mindfulness-based meditation, and demonstrating the huge benefits it can have to people's lives in schools, mental health, and all sorts of other issues. And when you start thinking about the aim being about people, being about how people feel, then you naturally come to questions about community. Because there's lots of research which shows that if people have friends, they are happier with their lives. Above a certain income level, it is far more important than extra money. It's having people you can talk to, having hobbies that you get involved with, places you can go to socialise. All of that matters massively, massively more once you get beyond the basics of life. And that's something which I'd like to see us look at much more. We've pushed for well-being assessments of government policies, trying to think very broadly about what effect will this policy have on people, as people. It's not very easy to do, but it's a really important switch which we're trying to make some process on. So there's a whole lot of aspects to it. And I hope as the MP over the last 5 years I've helped to connect some people, to bring some of that community to work with various different groups. And we've seen a number of successes, a number of things which I have to admit haven't yet worked. Some of these can take a long time to sort out. Some of it's about providing spaces for people. The change within the Sikh community, for example, of having new Gurdwara, has been really quite powerful. I know this place has made a huge difference to your community. To make sure that people can communicate, that there are easy ways for people to get in touch with like-minded people, to be able to interact. That's very helpful. Well, we've had a number of problems though as well, because bits of Cambridge are very well networked, very, very part of the community. Bits of Cambridge are not. You see lots of loneliness, particularly among older people. And we have to find ways to help with that. There's a number of ideas I'd throw in for how you do that. Some of them are organised programmes. Shomali Wright to talk about some of Macmillan's ideas, and there's a whole range of other ones. I think there's also a really interesting thing about what a city is. We're not a village, but in a village, one of the good things about villages is you do have people who know each other, who look out for each other because they see each other, because they can notice that Mrs. Jones, Mr. Smith, nobody's spoken to them for a bit. How do we get that to happen in a city like Cambridge, where not everybody knows each other? Part of it's about how you interact with the city. There are lots of benefits to things like walking, cycling, health benefits, mental health benefits, physical, mental, all sorts of things. One of the benefits of walking and cycling is that it becomes much more human. If you think back, when people did walk along the street, they noticed who was in, who wasn't, where something didn't seem right. They could talk, they could chat. You can walk past somebody else. If you drive past somebody else in their car, they're an anonymous lump of metal. So if we can go back to some of those good things about how we actually saw people as people, I think that will help to get community rebuilt. I don't think there's a simple answer. Those are just a few bits of what would be a really good answer, I hope. It's a really, really good question. It goes right to the heart of what is the point of life.
Well, this question resonates with me very deeply. Here in Juvat, now some of you might be interested to know what branch of Buddhism I belong to. So I'm an engaged Buddhist. I've studied with Ken Jones in this country. I've been on retreat for a significant period with Thich Nhat Hanh and Sister Chan Kong in Plum Village in France. I'm sure these names mean something to some of you. And basically the way that engaged Buddhists think about a question like this is we think that the fundamental idea in Buddhism that you have not just the Buddha and the Dharma, but also the Sangha, that idea has to be taken in its full extent and fully in the round. And we have to think of the Sangha always in context, and we have to think of it always as seeking to widen itself as much as possible. So when the question asks, what are we going to do about this increasingly fractured society in Britain? I think this is a very, very good question and a very deep question, and one that speaks to my condition. So let me briefly, in the time I have available, give you a couple of indications of the kind of things I think are crucial to rebuilding some of that society, some of that community, and not further fracturing it. So one example would be, I think we need to look for contexts and ways in which we can encourage people to become more self-reliant, in the sense of self-reliant as a group. So I'm thinking, for example, of things like community gardens and community allotments. I think that something which would be a great thing in Cambridge would be if we could re-establish more of the old tradition of market gardening around the edge of Cambridge. And if we could look to have some of those spaces as being very much community spaces. I hear what Julian says about cycling and walking and building community through that, and he is absolutely right. But it troubles me, I must confess to you quite deeply, that all three of the other candidates on this panel are in favour of further road building in this country, and road building and road expansion in and around Cambridge. For example, they all want to expand the A14. If we expand the A14, one of the things we're doing is we're fueling a more disconnected and a more fractured society. We're not fueling a society where people seem to work in and build their local communities, and where they're travelling more by bus or by bike or on foot. We're fueling a future in which people are more disconnected than ever because they're more stuck in their cars than ever. And a final example, to return to the food point, because this is food is, I think, a wonderful way of building community. It's not a coincidence that so much of our socialising revolves around having meals together or cooking together. To put things in a little bit of a bigger context, I think that we need to think about the future of food as being food not conceived of as a commodity, but food conceived of as, well, the essence of life. We need to forward concepts like food sovereignty. We need to be thinking about communities and this country as a whole as something that can and should increasingly feed itself, as people and communities as being able to feed themselves. We move in the opposite direction to that when we move in the direction of a neoliberal, globalised economic system. We can move back from that to a more localised future, and that will build community.
Hugely complicated question, one which I suspect we could probably spend the whole evening talking about, and we'll probably bring in all the rest of the questions. But I'm a socialist and a trade unionist, so I live partly in the community of work. And I think one of the things that has changed so much in the last few years is the fragmentation of work. For many people, their workplace, their colleagues, their comrades were there and provided a whole range of support. And that, of course, has changed so dramatically. So what is the community we're talking about? I think we still almost instinctively think in terms of village, geography. Actually, of course, in a globally connected world, you can actually find yourself in a community with other people through your phone, through the internet, in a completely different way, and not know the people who are physically next door. So I think the world has changed dramatically. But many of the things that have been spoken about, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's also, it is a resource question. I look at one of the communities which I think works very well that came out of the children's centres and Sure Start centres. I talked to young mums there who told me how isolated they felt before they got involved in that community. Well, that requires government action, resources, political choices to make those things happen. For instance, we know a lot of those services have come under huge pressure recently. I'll just finish by giving you one example, practical example of something which I think politicians or people in positions of responsibility and leadership can do. One of the things I'm proudest of that I've done in the last 10 years in Cambridge is I remember getting a call from someone who was, when one gets these calls, people distraught about something that was happening to their local community. There was a proposal from the Housing Association to make some major changes to the area of Cambridge and Romsey where people lived. And what struck me was two things. One, the sense of complete hopelessness, that nothing could be done, that it was going to be done to people, and a sense that not knowing where to turn. And actually didn't require very much. What it actually required was giving people some confidence to take control for themselves. And I remember being particularly struck, this woman invited me to her house. She had taken all the furniture out of the ground floor so there was room for her neighbours to come in. And we sat and talked for a while, and there was the usual cynicism. There was, oh, you know, no one will take any notice of all the rest of it. And I said, well, actually, I know the chief executive of the Housing Association concerned, and I think he's actually a reasonable person. Why don't you invite him to come along where I'm sitting now and just talk to him? And they all were very cynical about it. They said nothing won't make any difference. So I contacted him and said, would you go and talk to them? And he did. And they were amazed, because actually, the people who make decisions so often are remote from the people the decisions affect. And actually he listened, and he changed his mind. And the development didn't happen. And to me, that's empowering a community. Now, what did it need? It just needed someone just to give people a bit more confidence, because that's often what people lack. And that's what some of us can do. So I think there are lots of ways of building community. It can be big things, it can be small things like that. But there is no doubt that if you want the good society that so many of us do want, it is going to be based on those kind of changes.
Thank you. I'm going to move on from that. Perhaps we'll have a little bit more time for each of the questions, just have a little interaction. But I just asked the candidates to speak with a little less time on each of them for their future questions, so that we can try to get through what we've got here tonight. Now, we're actually going to segue quite well into the next, because this is something that candidates all touched on, is the effect of transport on community, on cars and buses, and the effect that they have. So these are it's local transport and congestion, and two questions that are connected. I'm going to ask the two questioners to read out both of their questions. First of all, from Prasad Michael. You can stand up, Prasad, and your question about the Christ Pieces bus station.
So the Buddhist Centre is in the Kite area of Cambridge, and I live opposite Christ Pieces, also in Kite. So we have a lot of worsening traffic in all the roads in this area, and especially bus congestion where I live in Manual Road. So my question is twofold. Can you reassure us that Stagecoach is not going to take any of Christ Pieces or any other green space for a large bus station? That's the first question. There's a lot of new building happening in and around Cambridge. How will the traffic, including buses, coming into the centre of Cambridge be managed? Pollution in Parker Street is above the European regulations, I've been told.
Thank you. So the other question is from Connor. Connor, are you here? Sorry, Connor. This is a student, A-level student. Okay.
As a 17-year-old, I'm required to stay in full-time education. I currently go to Compton Sixth Form, and by bus service provided by Stagecoach. I'm classified as an adult, and I have to pay an adult price. Many of my fellow students from the lower school, Compton Secondary School, and they have a service provided, a bus service provided by the council, which they have to use because they're spread out in all these villages. But once they turn 16 and they go to the sixth form, they have to pay, and it is quite pricey. It's between about £70 to £150, depending on where they are every term. And they're not working, and they have to rely on their parents. I know that this isn't a problem for 18-year-olds and under in London, but I'm sure there's other people like me across the country in this similar situation as MPs for Cambridge and parties. What can you do to change this?
Thanks very much, Colin. That's great. So I'll ask Rupert to start on this one.
Okay, so I've been asked to be briefer, as we all have, so I'm not going to seem to fully answer both questions. I'm going to try to address what of them I can in a short compass of time. So on the first question, well, I live by Christ Pieces as well. I live on Willow Walk, so I know what you're talking about. I'm concerned about it too, from a personal point of view as much as anything else. I think that we have to take the proposition of the question very seriously. I think that it's very concerning what's going on there. I'm especially concerned about the air pollution issue. Air pollution kills 100 people a year in Cambridge. Actually, it probably kills far more than that. Those are the government's own very conservative figures. What are we going to do about this? There are a number of things we have to do. We need to have a low emission zone for Cambridge. There's a low emission zone that's been brought in Brighton by the Green administration there. Low emission zones can be very effective in reducing pollution, and especially from buses. But more generally, what we need to do is have a holistic approach to transport, as I was gesturing at in my previous answer. We need to be thinking about how to reduce the amount of motorised traffic, and in particular the amount of car traffic and lorry traffic in general. And we need to be increasing the amount of walking and cycling, and we need to be increasing the amount of stuff that gets done from home without people needing to travel at all, for example through video conferencing. So that's why we in the Greens have brought in our Transport Green Print for Cambridge, which you can look at on our website if you're interested, where we propose a holistic approach to how to tackle these problems. And congestion charging is a crucial part of that approach. Unfortunately not something which any of the other parties are as yet willing to buy into, but I think it's inevitable, and the sooner we do it, the sooner we can actually get serious about tackling these kinds of problems. Final point, which relates to both the questions, which are both about Stagecoach. We believe, as Labour believe, but unfortunately the others present here tonight do not believe, in the re-regulation of the buses. We think that Stagecoach should be put back on a leash in the way that the buses are in London. And if any of you are familiar with London buses over the last decade, they're a lot more successful than the buses we have here in Cambridge.
Thanks. I think the challenge of talking about all of transport and being brief is quite a tough one given Cambridge. But I'll do my best. To pick up on the second question first from Connor, I think it's a great question. There are some funds, limited funds available to try to help, but it has to be a systemic fix. I would love to see free transport for people up to 18. It would make sense to match the age you have to go for education with that free traffic. The 16 made sense, and that was the limit, it should go up to 18. What we are offering as a party, it's in our manifesto that came out today, is 2/3 of all bus travel for young people. If they are working, if they're not working, whatever it might be. Because actually, it's two things. One is about the cost, make sure that we can reduce the cost. And the other is about encouraging young people to use public transport. That if you have a 17-year-old who is newly able to drive, all that excitement, you get past your test, you get to drive, and it feels like, at least, whether it actually is, a cheaper way of getting around anyway, why will you start taking the bus? Why will you start walking? Why will you start cycling? So by rebalancing that, hopefully we'll get more young people to actually take the bus and save money, and that will also mean we'll have more buses, that we won't have to keep fighting to save the buses that we have. Rupert said a lot of sense of things, he's not right on one thing, at least I would also like to see London style regulation of buses, and I've argued for that many times. I hope we can get to that, because if you can couple the routes together in particular, you will do a lot better. It's the right thing for Cambridge, and if, read our manifesto more carefully with it. I know it only came out today, but in fairness, it's our second hustings today, so we are still catching up. In terms of the situation, firstly on Stagecoach and taking price music, I really hope not. Those green spaces are so incredibly important that we desperately need them. And again, there's lots of wellbeing associations with access to green space. We can't turn the entirety of that into the city centre into a massive bus stop. We have to find ways of getting buses which will run through the city, not always terminating at the city centre, because there just simply isn't space to fit them all in. So, no to that. I used to chair the Cambridge Traffic Management Committee, which was a very difficult task, trying to fit everything in to the city centre. But it does touch on the rest of the question, because what we did was to put in a whole lot of things, the famous rising bollards and so forth, so that it didn't make sense for many trips to drive through the city centre. You talked about Parker Street being above the European standards. I remember when Parker Street was in the top 10 most polluted streets in the entire country, and all the ones above it were motorways. Because it used to be the main route coming through the city centre before the A14 was built. There are times when you do need some new roads. So you have to have decent standards for that. So how do we manage it? By getting people not to drive. That is the best solution. Whether it's buses, whether they should be electrified, whether it's walking, whether it's cycling, it's getting people not to drive. The one last thing I'll do, I hear the bell. I used to be our transport spokesperson, and the thing I never managed to get the Department of Transport interested in was alternatives to transport, to not travelling. I think that Rupert quite rightly raised. They said we're the Department for Transport, not the Department for not transport. But actually, it's a really great solution.
Sure, again, attempt to be brief. Starting with Connor's question, I was really proud of the educational maintenance allowance that Labour introduced in the last government. And just briefly wasn't specifically for that. And I think it was really tragic that was taken away by this government. Now, Labour isn't promising to reintroduce it in the same form. We'll certainly be looking at trying to find some way of helping with those kind of issues. So I think there's some possibilities there. On buses, this has been one of my sort of running themes for the 10 years I've been running for Parliament here. And I have to say I have a rather fractious relationship with Andy Campbell, the manager of Stagecoach in Cambridge. So much so that when I last went to see him, after he whipped out his map of saying I want to build a bus station on Christ Pieces, which he keeps in his office, I said I don't really think there's any chance. So, and he was right that he was have no chance on that. He then accused me of wanting to confiscate his buses because Labour wants to re-regulate the bus system. And I said, slightly going over the top, Andy, all we want to do is actually make sure that the local community has some say on the frequency of buses and on how much we pay for them. It doesn't seem totally unreasonable to me. But Stagecoach are the kind of the far end of the spectrum on this. Some of the other bus companies are a bit more reasonable and understand there is a point to this. So this is a big change for Labour. I spent much of the last Parliament, when Labour was in government, trying to persuade Labour ministers that in areas where Conservative county councils like ours would probably never use the powers that were given to them, but they have powers to do this. We're going to have to go further. And I'm pleased to say that the Labour manifesto is very clear on this. There will be the ability now to regulate. And that makes a big change, because there's a whole series of things you can do with that. But we have no illusion, this is a big fight, because this is a shift. It's Labour saying that we have a right to intervene in markets. And for many, many years, that's kind of almost been an assumption that somehow you should leave it to the market. Well, this is a huge shift. And I'd say for Labour, a brave shift, because this is what brings all the business and the media saying, you can't do that. Somehow the world will come to an end. Well, actually, it won't. They will accommodate it, and we can get some of these solutions. So some big opportunities there. In terms of air quality, absolutely right. And again, one of the things which I'd be critical of the current government of is they actually took away quite a lot of the air quality monitoring requirements for local authorities. Now, we don't actually need to do much because we know that we've got a problem there. But in the end, if we can regulate the buses, final point, had the station developments turned into the transport hub that many of us think it should have done, then some of these problems could be resolved, because the moment everything comes in to Trump Street, and it's not the right place for those kind of interchanges. But some of these is by local authorities, and one thing I'm very clear on is I think it's not right for MPs to be always telling local councillors how to run local government. That's what they're elected to do. What we must do is give them the powers to get on and do it, and that's exactly what I intend to do.
Thank you very much, Connor, for that important question and raising our attention to it. I think you're absolutely right. You should have free transport to get to school under the age of 18. And regardless of where our political manifesto might stand on that issue, I can guarantee you that I'm going to campaign for that, because for me, education is what has transformed my life. And I feel very passionately that you should be able to get to school without any inconvenience and without burdening your parents to get there. So thank you. In terms of open spaces and protecting them, our council candidates are running a huge programme in terms of campaigning to protect our precious open spaces in Cambridge. One of the beauties of Cambridge is that you have lots of greenery at the moment, and we mustn't destroy that. Many years ago, there was an ambition to try and seek World Heritage status in Cambridge, and I would like to revive that. And I think one of the ways we do that is by protecting the beauty, relying on our architectural history and the areas around the colleges, but also having a voice piece for Cambridge that really wants to champion that idea. In terms of regeneration programmes, we have an opportunity here in Cambridge to do something very unique. For too long, local authorities have approved very piecemeal, incongruous planning developments that I wouldn't say eyesores, but they're not as appealing to the eye as, for example, our colleges. And there is this great dichotomy. If you exit Cambridge Station, do you feel instantly, oh, I'm in Cambridge, other than the signs there? It kind of lets you down. And it doesn't give you that flavour of, wow, I'm in this great city. And I think that we need to look at our development projects with a more holistic approach of where do we see this going in 50 years' time. So, for example, take Canary Wharf as an area in London. Okay, that's too high rise, but it was developed with an idea in mind that this is what this whole area should look like. And I think that, for example, running up to along Newmarket Road, we've got those curries and those big sort of warehouse complexes. And I think we could utilise that space better and perhaps build accommodation. We're in dire need of housing in Cambridge. So I think we could regenerate the area properly, but for that you need a proper vision as to what you want this city to look like. Because if you do it in the piecemeal manner that has been typical of existing developments in Cambridge, then you don't get an overall aesthetically pleasing look. In terms of transport and buses, thank you, that won't be long. In terms of transport and buses, yes, pollution and air quality are a huge problem in Cambridge, and my ambition is to actually make Cambridge a C40 city so that it reduces its carbon emissions. It is doable. We have an uphill task here, but we need to think about measures, traffic calming measures, and you'll see some of you will get, and I hope all of you will receive, unless you live in blocks of flats, it's sometimes quite difficult to deliver, but you will get my composite leaflet that comes out showing what we want to do in the different wards, and that's about stopping speeding, introducing traffic calming measures, saving our green belt. There's lots of things that we as Conservatives want to do. Please give us that chance.
Thanks very much. Just very briefly, because I would like to hear a comment. Do you feel that how satisfied do you feel the responses are? Do you feel?
Yes, I welcome the different responses. I must say, and yeah, I'll be thinking about it. It's helpful.
Colin?
Yeah. I'm not asking like free bus fares, but a reduced price at least. I'm not an adult and I'm in education.
Okay, thanks very much. So on to the next question. We've got an issue on housing. It comes from Dharma City.
So in Cambridge, as well as other places in the UK, it seems to be very difficult to find affordable housing. And for many on average incomes, the dream of owning your own home or getting a rented home at a reasonable rent with stability is fast becoming impossible. In other countries, like Scandinavia, these markets are regulated to ensure fairness and to prevent the dire social consequences that come from inflated property and rental markets. Why can't we sort this out in the UK? Why do we believe the free market is the right solution? Is it the right solution?
Thanks, Dharma City. I have to say this was the top interest question, the one that was asked the most, was about housing. So we'll have the questions just after the end.
Can I just say, I'm a member of Unite, and there is a protest tomorrow evening because there is a property exhibition at the Corn Exchange, and there is a protest for council housing and for affordable housing from 5 o'clock tomorrow outside the Guildhall, which relates to the question.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so this is a very hot topic. It's popular with people asking. So I'll ask Julian to start on this one.
Thanks. Another topic where it's quite hard to do it all in a couple of minutes. And in fact, we have, I think, a whole evening on housing coming up, which I think is probably even then not enough to get through the issue. We have a massive problem in Cambridge and many other places with a housing shortage. Here, it's partly a problem of success. I remember how different Cambridge was decades ago. But people want to come here because there are so many jobs, because there's so much happening, and that puts the prices up. And it is a massive, massive problem. The main answer has to be to build more homes. There's a side part, which is to get empty homes into use, which would also be critical. But getting more housing is essential. And if we don't do that, then we are going to continue to have the sort of shortages that we have at the moment. And to get that to happen, we do have to look away from just free market options, because we know there are lots of sites where people just land bank, where they get permission to build and then they just wait. And they just wait for the price to go up and they wait and they wait and wait. And that doesn't work. And that's why we've seen actually government intervention to say that we are going to build in some sites. Northstoke, I think, is the closest example. To say, we'll actually we'll have to do it ourselves then, if no one else is going to get onto it. So you do have to move away. You also have to change some of the tenancy rules. This is something which I tackled. I had a bill in Parliament, a private members bill, looking at the private rented sector, calling for longer tenancies, which is something which is in our manifesto. Getting rid of letting agent fees, which can be absolutely extortionate. Looking at accreditation methods. Having an ombudsman, that's actually happened now to try to help in the private rented sector, dealing with rent evictions, as I mentioned. But ultimately, all of that will help, and that's important. But if you don't get more houses, and I do mean specifically as well affordable housing in the various different guises, shared equity, there's lots of different models, but also council housing. And Cambridge has just started, when we were running the council, to start building council housing. First time for a very, very long time. We had plans to build 2,000 council houses, which would make a huge, huge difference. It wasn't possible while Labour in government. There was a thing called negative subsidy, where huge amounts of money was taken away from Cambridge to support council housing elsewhere. It was not a good system. I think Labour admitted they got much of that wrong. In fact, in those 13 years, as a country, we ended up with 421,000 fewer social homes than when we started. We need those homes back. So this negative subsidy thing meant that over the 13 years, Cambridge lost £120 million paid by council tenants, taken away from Cambridge. South Cambs lost £118 million. If we had that £238 million in our area, we could have a huge number of new council houses and patch up all the rest of them as well. That would be a great thing to see. So there's a lot more to talk about. We have some schemes about rent to own to try to help people to pay the rent in new build houses in order to be able to own it. Help to rent as well, to do with deposits, many young people trying to leave home. And I think that's a much better option than expanding right to buy, which I think is a really bad policy. In fact, our manifesto says that we should suspend right to buy completely in areas that want to do that. I think Cambridge would be a great example. And all the money from it, if it's going to happen, should be used to build another council house. That's absolutely the right way to go. Ultimately, we have to get 300,000 homes a year. That's our manifesto position across the country, not all in Cambridge. 225,000 a year simply replaces the ones that we need, because there's household breakdown, people living longer, more population. We have to get over that to get prices down so they're more affordable. How do you do that? Some of that will be growth in cities, some of that will be existing things. Part of our big vision is to have garden cities, to build new places somewhere which will be designed to be good for community, good to integrate, on really good transport routes. So one example would be East-West Rail, which I've campaigned for 30 years, going from Oxford to Cambridge, linking up to Ipswich and so forth, which could include a series of garden cities along it, so there's really easy access to travel. And it would also come with Addenbrooke Station. That fits in very nicely. How much would it help Cambridge if we had a garden city 15 minutes by train west of Addenbrooke's, with easy access to Addenbrooke's, going on to the city centre, the railway station, and then the science park? That, I think, would really help us. That's something I'd like to deliver.
It's a really good question. I've spent probably most of my political life involved in housing policy in one way or another. And the plain truth is the problem for Britain has been we've for too long seen housing, properties, as about financial investment rather than actually being homes. And we've actually bedeviled the British economy as well. You compare our performance with other similar countries, with our obsession with home ownership, it has completely distorted our economy. So, can we do anything about it is a huge question and a really difficult one. But let me just run through 2 or 3 things. Firstly, of course we need more housing. And I hear what Julian says about targets and 250,000 and all the rest of it. But I mean, this Parliament has really been woeful in terms of the number of houses actually delivered. So you could ask yourself what's going to be different next time. Labour set a target of 200,000, which we think is realistic. We recognise it probably should be more, but we're talking about what we think can actually be achieved, and I think we will be able to achieve that. But within that, Firstly, more council housing, yes. I would defend what Labour did in government last time because we inherited a terrible council housing stock in huge need of a repair. Many people in Cambridge will have benefited from improved bathrooms, insulation, roofs, the whole lot. And there was a massive backlog, but I fully accept we didn't move quickly enough to shifting our investments into building new housing. So yes, more council housing, that would be a start. But private rented sector, 25% of people in Cambridge now living in the private rented sector, rents zooming up in this city. Again, just as I said before on the other issues, when markets don't work, you intervene. So Edward Abam's been very clear. We'll introduce 3-year tenancies as the norm, which stops that 6-month renegotiation where so many tenants in Cambridge find the rent has just been jacked up. And we'll crack down on the lettings fees. And it can't come from a private member's bill, it's got to be done through government legislation to actually make it happen. On market housing, yes, we do need more housing. And yes, Julian's right, we do need to stop the land banking. Huge resistance from the developers. They claim they don't do it. We don't believe them. We think we can put more pressure on. But I think a really big innovation will be Labour's proposal to say that on major developments, half of those homes should be available to first-time buyers. I think we're seeing in Trumpington at the moment a tragedy unfolding, really, in the sense that all that new housing that should have been available for local people, huge amounts of it are actually being bought up by investors, and then people were renting and running into all the problems I've just alluded to. Also, in terms of the finance side, Labour's proposal to use the new ISAs, which the government recently announced, to actually make sure the building societies put them on banks, put that money into housing. And that's actually a huge source of the potential funding. So, a whole range of things there, but I would echo Julian's point. The one thing you would never do, essentially, in terms of housing policy, is repeat the mistakes of the past. This proposal on housing associations seems to me to be absolutely astonishing. And not least for the Conservatives, surely the state doesn't intervene and tell civil society what it can and can't do. I mean, it's the kind of thing that is dismissed, I would sort of thought, as a very heavy-handed state intervention. A few individuals might benefit, but the tragedy would be locked into the same situation as before, where in 5 years' time we'll find those same houses there, but different people will be in them, they'll be bought by investors, there'll be people renting them, and that's why the housing benefit bill has shot through the roof. It is a completely failed system, and the idea that you do more of it rather than less of it is completely mad in my view.
So some of you will be aware, under this government, we've introduced the Help to Buy scheme and the shared ownership scheme. I hear what my friends on the panel have said in terms of the right to buy your council house. I've been knocking on doors in Abbey and Arborough where properties are in a very derelict condition sometimes, and the desire for home occupiers there to improve their garden or take some responsibility for their home is lacking. And I think that that also comes from a sense of not feeling that that place is their home. And that's the challenge. There are these properties which do need doing up. They're not being done up by the local authority at the moment. And I think that actually when you give someone the chance to buy their council home, you give them a sense of ownership. Now, where it went wrong is that we didn't continue to build. And I think we've learned from that. We had 13 years of a Labour government where we failed to build in terms of council houses, and I think that that's what has to change. So building more homes generally is obviously the way to solve the housing crisis. We have pledged to build 200,000 new starter homes for those under the age of 40 to be able to buy a new build at below market value. And another area that I think is so important in terms of stopping the artificial inflation of the housing market is I would introduce legislation so that developers had to lease the first phase of that development domestically, or domestically and internationally at the same time. Because all too often you go along to a brand new development and you ask them what property they have on their books, and they tell you, oh well, 40% of this development has already been sold in Singapore and Hong Kong and China. That doesn't wash on me, and I think that can be easily fixed through legislation. I also believe in creating satellite towns. If Cambridge is predicted to grow double in 10 years in terms of its population, if that happens, we can't all live in this confined space. We need a real alternative to public transport so that people can live a little bit further out, yet conveniently travel into Cambridge. And that's where I think our local authority in South Cambridgeshire, I would want to work with them, and I would want our councillors in Cambridge City to work with them, to really look at housing development properly around Cambridgeshire, giving people the access and the opportunity to work in Cambridge. So I think there's a lot to be thought about. I've given you a few ideas, and I hope that you will see, whilst successive governments failed in terms of the right to buy your council house, there have been some massive achievements in terms of what individuals have been able to accomplish in their lifetime. The chairman of Cambridge City Conservatives, he was kicked out of home aged 15. He grew up in a council house, and he thought there's no chance he'd even own his first car. Today he owns his own property, and that came about through Margaret Thatcher. Thank you.
Well, it's a hugely important question. The question ends with a very clear question. Is the free market the right solution? And there is a very clear answer, no. Houses are somewhere to live, not something to speculate on. So yes, we should have rental controls. And the Green Party manifesto, which was out yesterday, has very strong proposals on how to do this. But I want to highlight two other areas which are related to this. Firstly, what we're also calling for in the Green Party is a right to rent policy. What does that mean? Basically what that means is, if people fall into mortgage arrears, they're in danger basically of losing everything. And we say, no, they shouldn't lose the potentiality to continue to live, at least, in their own house. So the idea would be that while the house might be technically reclaimed, the people living there would be able to carry on living there at a fair rent set by the rental controls. And secondly, our proposals on building new houses. We want to build 500,000 social homes over the life of a parliament. It's the only way in the long run you can really guarantee that you're going to have affordable housing is to have council housing. And so it's not enough, therefore, to just suspend the right to buy where local councils want to suspend it. The right to buy needs to be ended. If you don't end the right to buy, you're basically saying we're not serious about council housing. And if you're not serious about council housing, you're not serious about affordable housing. Final point, I agree with much of what the other panellists have said about the importance of taking serious measures to address what's going to happen as Cambridge expands, but we of the Greens do differ from the other parties in this regard. We don't think there should be an open check on the endless expansion of Cambridge. We need a return in this country to regional policy. We need to think more carefully and act accordingly to try to regenerate and develop parts of this country that actually want and need that regeneration and development, rather than allowing market forces to let rip and essentially having endless further development in London and the South East, while other parts of the country are impoverished and fall further and further behind. So places that need more development and more regeneration, they should get more assistance from central government for that to happen, and then there would be less pressure on housing in Cambridge.
Thanks very much to all. So we're going to move on actually. I'd like to, we've got one more local question, which is on NHS. I'd like the candidates, we've only got a shorter period of time to look at some national issues, which I think are important. I'm not saying that the NHS is not important. It was the second most asked question that I had from people submitted. But however, just to perhaps keep it a little bit short on the NHS. However, there are two questions from two people. One from Patrick, who's working as a nurse and qualified. So, Patrick, if you could.
What do you think of the current state of the NHS? And do you think it provides holistic care, taking into account people's physical, emotional and spiritual needs?
Okay, so that's one question, and the other question is from Birgit. If you could, so these two together again. So Birgit, please.
Mental health services for young people in Cambridgeshire are short of qualified staff, and waiting lists for treatment of mental disorders are up to 10 months or longer. What are you going to do about it?
Okay, so that's been asked in other contexts, the poor relative, the poor cousin that mental health is within the NHS. So I'll ask Daniel to start on this one.
Why is the NHS my passion? I address this partly to my friend Richard Taylor in the gallery. I'll tell you why it is. It's because it encapsulates all the values that are important to me as a socialist and a Labour politician. When my dad was taken into Papworth a few years ago, I turned up anxious, thinking he was close to death, and he was. Everything was being done. The most expensive care in the world was available. If it was housing, if he wasn't properly housed, that wouldn't happen. For the NHS, everybody gets the best. But the current state of the NHS, I'm afraid, is far from that. And we will trade figures briefly, I suspect, on this, but I think the evidence is absolutely clear. If you look at Edinburgh at the moment, under terrible pressure and strain, the waiting list figures, the waiting times for X-ray and A&E speak for themselves. 23,000 people waiting more than 4 hours over the last couple of years. If you talk to staff, very demoralised, frequently quite unhappy, of course didn't get the pay rise that they should have done from the independent pay review body. You can't run a system like that. So what's the answer? Can it be changed? And I say yes, because Andy Burnham and Labour are talking about completely transforming the way our health work. We call it whole person care. It's actually breaking down those old distinctions between physical care, acute care, and mental health, for instance, bringing the services together. Tragically, in Cambridgeshire, we've just been through a process which disintegrated care, moved social care back to the county council. This is a huge, huge project. It won't be done quickly, but it could be the big idea for the 21st century that the NHS was for the 20th century. And I'm so excited about it because it really, really would transform people's lives. And I can't explain that to you all in 2 minutes. I will just briefly allude to the point you make about young people's mental health services in Cambridgeshire. It's a disgrace what's been going on, quite frankly. Those weights you allude to, absolutely outrageous. And Julian will say how important mental health is to the Liberal Democrats. But I have to say, there's been a Liberal Democrat in charge of our mental health services at government level for the last few years, and they've got to take some responsibility for what's happened. So judge partly on what's happened in the past. I'm proud of the way Labour left the National Health Service in 2010. I'm alarmed by the way it is today. I'm determined that we transform it after the election.
So the question asks, what do the candidates think of the state of the NHS currently? And my answer is, well, I think it's a bit ill. That sounds like a funny thing to say, but it's also a kind of really sad thing to have to say, and a really bad thing to have to say. And I do have to say to Daniel, he's proud of the state in which Labour left the NHS, but of course Labour left the NHS in a state where it was more privatised than it was when Labour came in. And that's part of why the NHS is ill. And Cambridgeshire has particularly been a victim of this experiment of NHS privatisation under Labour and then under the Conservatives and Lib Dems, most strikingly with Hinchinbrook Hospital. So what we say in the Green Party is to remedy this illness, the NHS needs to be returned to being a proper public service again. And that means we need to drive out the private sector from the NHS. Labour say, well, let's keep the private sector to about 5%. That's very risky, by the way. It could make us vulnerable to the health services being opened up if the TTIP treaty comes in, the undemocratic Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Treaty, which if you don't know about it, be afraid, be very afraid, you look into it, threatens the future of the NHS potentially and much more besides. What we say is no to the privatisation of the NHS. No, it's simple. Now, turning to mental health, I'm a strong advocate of mindfulness-based cognitive behavioural therapy, of which I've been fortunate enough to be, among other things, a recipient. But you know what? We also have to talk about the root causes of mental ill health. And the number one root cause of mental ill health, we now know, we'll come and talk to you about this in a little while, is inequality. And inequality has been rising in this country for a long time now, under successive governments, once again including under the Labour government. And also, if we're thinking about holistic care, we need to not just think about the holistic nature of a person, but we need to think about the holistic nature of a nation or of a community or of us all. And we need to take into account the interactions between different areas of policy. This is hugely important to us as Greens. So how do transport policy and food policy and education policy, how do these all feed into or destroy health policy? So if you have a transport policy, for example, that results in more air pollution, well then you're just making more medical problems that the NHS needs to therefore come in and solve. So Green Party policies are joined up so that the NHS has less work to do ultimately once our policies start coming in. And finally, to return to mental health, which is so important, the cuts in mental health have been so destructive, cuts to psychiatric services, austerity cuts. We in the Green Party believe passionately in the concept of mental health emergency. I had a friend who came very close, a Buddhist friend who came very close to killing himself a few years ago. It's a tragic and appalling story. The apex of the story was when a friend of his and of mine and myself and his GP were working hard to try to save his life. We got in touch with the crisis team, who were very overstretched, and they said to us at one point, well, you know what, sometimes you just have to let someone go. But we weren't willing to let him go. And that kind of situation in which the cuts are so severe, the constraint is so severe, that someone in a crisis team will say something like that, that should never be allowed to happen again. Mental health emergencies need to be taken just as seriously as physical health emergencies.
Thank you very much. I think the NHS is probably, for me, one of the #1 issues in this election. Some of you will be aware my mother was a midwife between 1967 and 1987. And I grew up hearing nothing but praise for our dedicated healthcare professionals. And that's why the NHS means so much to me. I was also born at home about 10 days too early. There wasn't enough time to get to hospital, so Mum had to do the whole delivery herself, which is a little bit awkward, but I'll spare you the details. Dad was in shock at the material time, and if not for Mum's training, she wouldn't have been able to do that, and there were added complications of me being out for too long and still attached, etc. And it was Mum's training in the NHS that gave, that I am so appreciative of, because I know that that's the reason I'm here today. I'm so proud that we are committed in the Conservatives to an NHS that is free at the point of delivery. You'll have heard about privatisation. It started under Labour, and under this government there's been an incremental increase in privatisation. However, we are committed to giving patients a free national health service, and we do that by ensuring funding, and ensuring that we educate patients as to the alternatives that are available to them, and giving out of hours access to GPs as one example, and also by creating efficiency within the National Health Service. I learnt with the Macmillan nurses, whilst they can be contracted out from the NHS, they provide a level of service that is unparalleled as far as I can see, in terms of a unique sense of compassion that they have for their patients, which brings that comfort at a very needed time in someone's life and to families. And I think, I was talking to the Macmillan nurses, and I think that there is an area for some of that training to come back into the NHS. During my mother's time, I was always told it was different. They had matron who ran the ward, and whilst the NHS is still considered the envy of the world in many respects, it was run very differently in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And I think we need to get back to some of that holistic sense of care. Not the idea that it's, oh, it's not my department, I can't deal with that. Someone comes in to give birth and they were told, oh, we haven't got a clean bed for you. In Mum's time, whether you were the senior midwife or not, you scrubbed and cleaned that bed and got everything ready so that the labour process would be slightly easier. In terms of mental health, it is a big problem in this country, and it has been neglected for a long period of time by successive governments. We're very proud in the Conservatives to be able to announce a shorter waiting time of 18 weeks that we have as our target for people to access therapeutic services. Thank you for the bell. And under this government, we have delivered specifically for Cambridge 165 million to move Papworth Hospital to Cambridge. We've also put the highest any government has into the NHS, 12.9 billion, which has resulted in 9,500 doctors, 7,000 new nurses, and 2,200 midwives. There is a lot to do. The NHS is a black hole. You can go in for an operation on your stomach and find out that you have a heart problem. It has to be treated. You can't account for that. So there's a lot to be done, but partly it's education, educating patients, giving them responsibility as to what their care might be, but it's also about funding. And funding, I'm afraid, comes with having a strong economy.
To pick up the first question about how is the NHS doing, it's doing much more than it's ever done before. And that's why it is under massive strain. And this is at heart a real problem with our NHS. When it was set up, it was believed that it would become cheaper to run it every year because people would be healthier. We're able to do much more, and that's brilliant. People who would have just died decades ago, we can keep them alive, but that does cost money. And so the figures are very clear how much more is happening. I mean, Daniel talked about Addenbrook's figures. Addenbrook's have seen almost 9,000 more people a year within 4 hours at A&E. Much more activity. How do we cope with that? Now, one of the things we have, I mean, Addenbrook's now have 180 more doctors than they had, 305 nurses, midwives and ODPs. We're getting more staff to tackle with that. But it's going to continue being a huge challenge. So we have to do much more to reduce the costs, much more prevention, much more tackling things before they become a serious problem. And there's a lot that we can do about that, to do with how people live, active transport. If we were to cycle, there's a paper in the Lancet, if we were to cycle at Dutch levels, that would save the NHS £17 billion over a couple of decades. £17 billion, pretty useful money. You can do a huge amount with that. And, I mean, Daniel talks about the Labour's legacy, and there were some good things. And there were some bad things. There are things like the NHS IT project that cost, I think, £12 billion and never worked. What else could we do with that money? Don't get me started on the hospital, by the way. There were the PFI projects. Hugely expensive things. I think people forget how much they are. Just to give you the actual figures. The Peterborough PFI, £336 million of work. Total repayment cost £2 billion. 18% of the entire budget of that hospital is just going to paying off the PFI. Again, money sucked out, and Cambridgeshire was the test bed for all of this. The Hinchinbrook one, which left Hinchinbrook in such a bad state, Labour decided to put it out to the market for tender. 3 private companies leading for 3 bids. They decided to privatise it. And we know how badly that went on. What's the future? It has to involve more money. And the Chief Executive of NHS England, Simon Stevens, has said the minimum that the NHS needs by 2020 is £8 billion. That's going to be pretty tough to achieve. £8 billion. My view is that our job as politicians is to find that money, not to squabble about the amount. It's to find that cash. We've gone through, and there are tax rises that we need in order to provide that. There's a full detail of how we get there, to find £8 billion. The Conservatives, rather belatedly, have said they'll do £8 billion, but haven't really worked out how to fund it. Labour have said they won't provide the £8 billion. They're looking at a much smaller figure. They're actually saying they'll provide less money to the NHS than it says it needs. We have to get that £8 billion in. And if I am re-elected, I will push to ensure whatever the government is, gets that £8 billion the NHS needs. On mental health, and it's really good that it's being talked about because it is just too rare to get talked about. If you look at the leaders' debates, when NHS was talked about, only Nick Clegg mentioned mental health. When we started talking about mental health, all the experts said, don't bother, it's not politically attractive. And we said, but it's important. We're not doing that well in the polls anyway. Let's actually push on. And it turns out it is actually politically attractive. I had a stall about mental health at the Mill Road Winter Fair. I see some people who went to it. People were queuing to sign a petition to get more money into mental health. Because there have been cuts to mental health, it's been underfunded for decades. I remember my predecessor, David Howarth, campaigning against cuts on mental health in the last Parliament. It's not a new thing. We're beginning finally to reverse it, 1.4% increase this time. We have to go so much further. And that's why we've fought so hard to get more money into £150 million deal with eating disorders in young people. Did you know that these are some of the biggest killers of young people, anorexia and bulimia? We've now managed to get in the last budget £1.25 billion over 5 years for child and adolescent mental health, and that should directly fix the problem that you're talking about. It will also, some of that will be for pregnant women and new mothers, because there are some real crises there. But we have to go much, much further. We've legislated for parity of esteem. We have to deal with the stigma around mental health. If you show up to work with a broken arm, people might joke a bit about how you did it, but they won't have any particular problems. Show up and tell them that you're depressed, and a number of them will take a step backwards and not know what to do. We have to stop that.
So I'm going to ask Major Raja to speak on the national issue of climate change.
Okay, well, you'll all be aware of the growing evidence of man-made climate change. My question is, are we doing enough to address that? And what would your party do to respond to climate change?
So I'll ask Julian to speak on that first.
Yeah, that's a really good question. As I mentioned right at the start, the environment and climate change as part of that is one of the key things that motivates me. It is the biggest crisis that faces us as a species. We're already seeing problems around the world. We're seeing international pressures caused by it. We're seeing flooding. We're seeing much more unusual events. So are we doing enough? Absolutely not. You know, we're unlikely to even hit a 2-degree warming. And I'm not sure 2-degree warming is what I would consider doing enough. So we have to go much, much further. It is incredibly serious. We've made some progress over the last 5 years. I should say the Labour government brought in the Climate Change Act with cross-party support, and that's been a really good thing. You know, that was really important. We have to keep much of that going. And in this government, we've had some differences with our coalition partners on this, as we've tried to push further ahead. We have seen some really good things. We fought for and won the Green Investment Bank. We fought for a whole lot of other investment as well. And we've actually seen the amount of renewables almost triple during those 5 years. It's not talked about, which is a great shame. There are some great successes we've had there. We've insulated a whole number of homes. There's way more to go on all of this. There are some decisions I didn't agree with, like fracking. I led the vote to have a moratorium on fracking, so we shouldn't do it, because it diverts us from a low-carbon future, and that's incredibly important. I could talk about this for a lot more. What else are we offering? On the front page of our manifesto, we have our top key things. We actually delivered almost everything on the front page of our manifesto last time. I hope we will this time. It includes mental health, for example. It also includes 5 green laws. And that's the heart of what we will push for, and the heart of what we would insist on any government we may be involved with in any way. Or a majority Lib Dem government, you know, who knows. And those 5 laws will make a massive difference, a step change in what we're doing. So the first one is a nature bill, focusing on biodiversity, clean air, access to green spaces, marine conservation zones, a whole lot of things in that space. We've worked with RSPB to design that. A heating and energy efficiency bill, because not using energy is the greenest thing you can do. A zero waste Britain bill, and a zero carbon Britain bill. We want to get to zero carbon by 2050, not just part way there. And that includes phasing out coal, decarbonisation, a whole lot more. And a green transport bill, because transport is a huge contributor. So those 5 bills, if we can get those done, and there's a lot more detail online, that will mean we can start to be much more serious. We then have to play our role getting the rest of the world on board, and that is a big challenge. But we have to show by leading, and I hear too often this argument, such and such a country isn't bothering to do enough, so we shouldn't bother. We have to do it here, and we have to get them to do it there.
Part of my work as a policy advisor for the Coalition for the International Court for the Environment is to look at ways that we can get countries to comply with their original Kyoto protocols. So you'll remember the Kyoto protocols were introduced and then nobody complied with them. And that's because there wasn't an international institution that could call countries to account. And that's the idea with the International Court for the Environment. But it's also about giving access to justice, access to environmental justice, to communities and to states and to individuals. So that, for example, like the Bhopal disaster, the level of redress and compensation achieved was determined by Indian standards rather than an international standard. So I'd be looking at introducing, through this government, championing the idea of an international court for the environment that has teeth, that can hold countries to account and can impose sanctions when necessary when those countries don't meet their carbon emissions targets. I think we have a real opportunity in Cambridge to have a strong green voice in Parliament. And I believe that that opportunity exists for you through me, and also because Cambridge is this great city, as I said before. Our global reach gives us the chance to talk about issues such as climate change on a global stage. It would be wonderful in my eyes if Cambridge or Cambridgeshire could host one of the COPs, the Conference of the Parties. It's very ambitious, but I think we've got some fantastically bright minds in this city, and I think that we should be leading the way in terms of tackling climate change. Some of the policies we've introduced under this government, the Green Investment Bank, that's driving partnerships between private companies and a government-funded bank into green projects up and down the country. And here in Cambridge, the Energy Centre is something that is funded partly by the Green Investment Bank. It's going to be built on near Adam Brooks, and the advantages are that it will cut carbon emissions at the hospital. Some of you will be aware that the boilers and generators and the energy systems at the hospital are very high pollutants, and that's partly because they're sort of 25 years old. We need to replace those with more renewable sources of energy, but also up-to-date modern systems that save on energy. There are developments, and the development that I live in Cambridge is quite ecologically friendly, and I think that we need to replicate those models for any future developments that we have in Cambridge. The Green Investment Bank, the Renewable Heat Incentive, lots of our corporate social responsibility measures, and one of the things I would like to introduce personally as a private member's bill, not just the Coalition for International Corporate Environment, which requires this government, the British government, to work with international countries to achieve that through an international treaty, but actually I would want to push for greater corporate social responsibility that looks at environmental issues. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Kitaraja, for this question, because this is nothing less than the great question of our time. And the way I hear or feel this question is, what are we doing to our children? What are we doing to our great-grandchildren? What inheritance are we leaving them? They are our flesh and blood. They're not here yet, but they are our flesh and blood. And what are we doing to them? This is what future generations will judge us on, this question. So the Green Party has a whole raft of policies which none of the other parties have to address this question. On transport, for example, we would go far further and far faster in decarbonising it in the kind of ways I indicated briefly earlier. We want to end fossil fuel subsidies. We want to drastically reduce and rapidly the terrible waste that comes with eating in this country. In most of the buildings in this country, we heat the sky, essentially. And that doesn't make sense, doesn't make any sense at all. We need to have a program for rolling out insulation of every house and every publicly owned building in Britain within a short period of time, and that's what we would do. And we need to move to 100% renewable energy as the basis of this country. It's possible. Zero Carbon Britain and other reports have shown how it's possible. We shouldn't go down the route of the toxic time bomb of nuclear power and trying to jump out of the nuclear, the warming frying pan. Metaphors are slightly mixed there, but I think you see. So the other parties talk a good talk at great length on this issue. But if you want a strong green voice in Parliament, I think you know in your heart which party can be deeply trusted on this, the greatest issue of our time.
I've been a member of Labour's environmental campaign Sierra for the last 20 years and a member of the National Executive for 10, so I've been closely involved in Labour's policies in government and since. And I think the last Labour government actually had a very good record. How we tackle this? It starts with the individual, it goes through to the global. Individually, of course, there are things we can do, and locally there are things we can do. I think that the Cambridge Retrofit project, for instance, that Crawford Brown and others are working on, is a really exciting project, because the problem is, new house building, Labour introduced much tighter environmental standards. One of the first things the Coalition did was scrap those very tight environmental standards. But the truth is, most of the housing already exists, and the big challenge, particularly like Cambridge, is how you retrofit those homes. And Labour's going to do it not on an individual piecemeal basis, which doesn't really work, but on a neighbourhood basis. That will be challenging in some places, but we think it's the only way it's actually going to be achieved. So there will be huge savings for people. I'm afraid the Green Deal, the government scheme, has been a total failure, and it's a tragedy that we have found ourselves in a position where we're about the only country that hasn't had a proper home insulation scheme for the last few years that hasn't worked. So there are things we can do locally, but actually the big win is to work with others internationally. That's partly why stepping aside from the international community by potentially walking away from the European Union is not a good idea in my view. But you've got to work in partnership with others. And those are hard negotiations. I think Ed Miliband, when he was Climate Change Secretary, as Julian alluded to, with the Climate Change Act in 2008, that was seen by virtually everyone worldwide as the way to do it in a negotiated way. Because partly these are technological changes. It needs big investment, but it needs long-term certainty for people to invest in the right kind of way. So that's why you do it in stages. That's why we've set out carbon budgets that are being negotiated. The next one coming along will probably be more challenging than the last, but it can be done in a structured way. And when we come to those Paris climate change negotiations later in the year, I suppose I ask myself, who would I rather have there? Ed Miliband will go there as Prime Minister, or if the Conservatives win the election, who knows? Just look at their record in terms of who they've had as Environment Secretary. You could have ended up with Owen Wilson there. That's the difference. That's the difference this election will make. So this is, as Rupert has said, it's a defining issue for our century in many ways. Global justice also runs from it when you look at the impact of climate change on places like Bangladesh, the big community in Cambridge. It is the huge issue. It can be done, but only if you stay engaged with the rest of the world. I'm optimistic. It can be done, but it'll only be done if you've got the right people negotiating it.
Okay, so we're going to conclude with the one last issue. I'm going to ask two quick questions to ask on this. It's on the economy, two different questions. So first of all, from Mark Harper.
Since the 1980s, our country has bought into the neoliberal economic consensus of efficient markets, in that this is good for everyone. Our natural experience seems to be that the result is actually a less vibrant, low-skill economy with lower growth, lower wages and less job security. Companies are increasingly run to maximise short-term returns to investors rather than in the long-term interests of the country. Do you agree with this assessment? And if so, what would your party seek to do about it in government?
Okay, and so that's great, thanks Mike. So the other question connected is from John Turner again. So John, does.
It has been shown by numerous studies that inequality within a country leads to unhappiness across society. Given that the UK is one of the most unequal societies in the world, how would candidates resolve this problem?
Okay, so hopefully this is addressing the sort of the nature of the neoliberal consensus and also inequality. So I'll ask Shamara to start on that, please.
Mark, I disagree. I feel that statistics have shown, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies have agreed, that we are, and the IMF, that we are the fastest growing economy in Europe. And we have managed to create 1.85 million jobs under this government, 80% of which are full-time. 760,000 new businesses have started up here in Cambridge. 5 of those startups have gone on to be billion-dollar companies. And in Cambridge, we have the clean tech cluster, the biotech cluster, we have the Business Innovation Centre. We've actually got a good model that needs to be replicated across Britain. Unemployment is around 1.8% in Cambridge, which is very low. We want to get to a situation in the next government we've planned for full employment. If you look at the history books, every successive Labour government since 1945 has left office with unemployment higher than when it took office. I think what you need is a fast-growing economy which looks at apprenticeships, giving young people the skills they need to access jobs, but also job security by having a competitive jobs market. Here in Cambridge, one of the reasons people come to work as scientists in Cambridge is if they lose their job within the company they are in, they can easily access another job within the science sector without having to move family and home. There is a lot to be done in terms of the national picture, and unemployment has to be reduced. And I think the way you do that is to continue to create jobs. And that's not David Cameron going out and saying, here's a job, here's a job, here's a job. That's having the conditions right for business, so that employers, if any of you have been self-employed, run your own business or run a business in conjunction with anyone else, you'll know that what motivates you to take on more staff, what motivates you to hire more people, what motivates you to grow your business. It's if you see confidence in the economy, you know, right, you can take that risk. No one benefits in an economic downturn, except of course insolvency practitioners and perhaps the insolvency lawyers. So I think it is about having a strong economy. There may have been examples in the past where the type of economy we have hasn't stimulated the growth that we needed, but right now, particularly in Britain, we are an example of how we have got this right in terms of the economy.
Yeah, well, in terms of Mark's question, do I agree with his assessment? I agree with it broadly. It's a great question. I love it. There's one part of it I don't agree with, which is the bit where Mark says we've had a low-skill economy with lower growth, implying that that's necessarily a bad thing. But let's step back and ask ourselves a radical question. What's an economy for? Right? What we say in the Green Party is that an economy is to serve us, not the other way around. And I think as a society and as a world, we've forgotten that. And we've fallen into this trap of thinking that the number one objective for politics and for everybody is more economic growth. No matter what, everything else follows from that. And we say in the Green, no, that's not the number one objective. In fact, it doesn't even need to be an objective at all. In a country like this, there's enough to go round already. What would more economic growth be for here? There's enough to go round if we share it. And the brutal reality about the continual push for more and more economic growth is that it's a way of not sharing. Right? It's a way of saying to everybody, don't talk about sharing, don't worry about distribution, because everybody's going to get more because of the glories of trickle-down economics. And all of the three main parties have bought into this over the last generation. And it needs to end. So let's be for sharing, and then we don't need to be for growth. On the crucial, brilliant question about inequality, as I said in my opening remarks here this evening, there is a crisis of inequality worldwide and in this country. And the more inequality there is, the less society there is, the less community there is, the less trust there is. And the more inequality there is, the more ill health there is. So Julian said earlier, well, people thought in the early days of the NHS that when you had an NHS, it would be okay because costs would come down because people would become healthier. But the problem, Julian, is that people haven't become healthier. Like, they haven't become healthier because we've had an epidemic of heart disease, which is partly a result of rising inequality. Because we've had an epidemic of mental ill health, which is partly a result of rising inequality. Because we've had an epidemic of cancer, which is partly a result of increasing environmental damage in our society and in our world. So what's the answer? We need to create a more equal society. How are we going to do that? The Green Party has the tools. We'll bring in a wealth tax on the wealthiest. We'll raise income tax to 60% on the very richest. The last Prime Minister to have set income tax at 60%, that radical socialist firebrand Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, if it's good enough for her, then for goodness sake, can't we get it back up to that level at least? We are the only ones to bring in a land value tax, and we will make the minimum wage a living wage. That would be one of the first demands we make if we have a phalanx of Green MPs elected to Parliament after this election, one of whom might come from Cambridge. And our longer-term wish would be to move towards having a citizen's income, which would end the poverty trap and the unemployment trap and wage slavery once and for all. So, final point about this. I must take issue with Jamali's, I thought, slightly complacent remarks about Cambridge right now. Yeah, there's lots that's great in the economic situation in Cambridge right now, and there's 4,700 people in the last year who are dependent on food banks. We in the Green Party have just issued a report on food banks here today. This is a very divided city. I would ask you to consider when you vote on May 7th how we can heal this community and this city and this country. Which of these candidates is going to do the most to create a more equal society?
Got it right. What we're getting it wrong, for goodness sake. exactly as Rupert said, 5,000 people having to use the food bank in this rich city. Cambridge has seen one of the biggest falls in real living standards anywhere in the country. And when people say to me sometimes, what are you going to cut? I say, low pay. Cut low pay, because actually that's part of the economic issue here. We've got a system now where people are being employed on 0 hours contracts, on very low pay. 12,000 people in Cambridge earning below the living wage of £7.85 an hour in a high-cost city. It doesn't work economically because those people aren't contributing in terms of taxes. And put it all together, and what it actually shows is why this government has completely failed in its own terms to achieve what it set out to do at the beginning. David Cameron said it would be a moral failure not to have eliminated the deficit by the end of this Parliament. But in which case he's got no business asking for another term, because he hasn't even got halfway. And the reason he hasn't got halfway is precisely that low pay economy. So inequality matters, and in 4 weeks, 3 weeks, you've got a chance to elect a Prime Minister who's actually concerned about inequality. And I fully accept the last Labour government wasn't concerned enough, in my view, about it. Some of us were, but they weren't. Edward the Bad is a huge opportunity. And I genuinely believe that he is absolutely committed to this. So the kind of things that we'll be doing, we talked about raising the minimum wage by 2019 by £3,000 a year. We talked about the living wage, big campaigns in Cambridge I and others have been involved in. Isn't it astonishing? We've got a university, great university, that can raise £1 billion in a bucket collection, but still can't find it in itself to make sure it pays a living wage. I think that's outrageous. Still 1,000 people in the university not earning a living wage. And then at the top, yes, we are going to tax more aggressively. We are going to crack down on the scams. We are going to introduce a mansion tax on properties of more than £2 million to invest in the National Health Service. So there are things that can be done. But the question is, what do you want in 3 or 4 weeks' time? It's a real choice. It's absolutely clear to me that unless Labour wins in Cambridge, it will be another Conservative government for another 5 years. For those of you who are concerned about concerned about inequality, this is our chance. This is our moment. Come with me and make it happen.
Thanks. It's tempting to reflect on how often Daniel says, I know the Labour government got it completely wrong, but trust us this time. And we did see rising inequality under the last Labour government, as we saw the sale of council houses. But I don't want to go down that route any more than that. Because actually I want to talk about the issue of the question behind it, and I touched on this earlier. And it's this idea of well-being economics, that actually we are measuring completely and utterly the wrong thing. I apologise to the other panellists, we've done so many of these, they've heard this from me many, many times before. But let's say we were to trash this entire room. I'm not suggesting we do it. Let's say we were and then rebuild it. GDP would have gone up. The economy would be doing better. Would we feel things were in a better state? If you smoke and get lung cancer and get treatment at Addenbrooke's, the economy's done better. GDP's up. Great, fantastic. We spill oil at sea, clean it up. GDP's gone up. Why are we measuring something which tells us so little about things that we actually care about? And that's the idea of well-being economics, that's the idea of the New Economics Foundation. I've been very involved with both of those. We've published a number of reports on how it links to mental health, on how it links to arts and creativity, on how it links to housing, on how it links to pretty much everything else. And I would love to see us start to think less about GDP, which is a rubbish measure, and more about humanity, more about well-being, more about things that affect us. That's a really big, profound change. It says that essentially that we haven't been measuring the right things, our targets are wrong. So the whole question, yeah, we've been looking at the wrong things, we're measuring them all, and it relates to all these other measures. People who are unemployed, shockingly, are less happy with their lives than people who have a job they want. If you measure well-being, you pick up unemployment. You pick up inequality. And there's a few subtleties to exactly how it works. So you have to tackle things like that. So a complete change in how we think about it is something which I have argued for and will continue arguing for. And I think that will make a profound change to how we operate. Now, things in Cambridge, we have seen unemployment come down. Unemployment is now less than half what it was in 2010. I don't claim the credit for that personally. But having it come down is fantastic. Youth unemployment is about a third of what it was in 2010. And that's brilliant, so young people are able to get some chances there. That's great, but there is so much more to do because we do have this huge problem of inequality. So what would we do? I've worked very closely on a number of occasions with the Living Wage Foundation. There are two things they push for. One, as you might guess, is the living wage. I've pushed for that, and I've pushed the university. I think the university is mostly paying out, so most of the colleges that are problematic, and I've pressed every single one of those. We're getting more and more companies. I think we have a couple of cafes now that are paying the living wage. They should all be paying the living wage because there are benefits for them as well as for their employees. The other thing the Living Wage Foundation says is they want us to continue lifting poorly paid people up out of paying income tax. Because why should somebody who is on the national minimum wage be expected to contribute by way of income tax? It's a minimum. How can it make sense to say, here's the minimum, and we'll take some of it back from you? That, to me, makes no sense at all. And that's why I'm proud that we've made a lot of progress on that. It's been a tough fight to deliver it, but something that the Living Wage Foundation and many others support. We would also have more taxes on wealthy. We've closed many loopholes, but there are way more to go. We have to rebalance that. We have to collect more money from those who are wealthiest and less from those who are poorest. Just to finish off, because I think this is the last question, I hope you found it an interesting time. I suspect many of you know the things that I've delivered on in the last 5 years. I spoke about them in the beginning. You may have had 1 or 2 leaflets through your letterboxes highlighting them all as well. If not, let me know and I'll give you some more. I hope what you've got a sense of today as well, though, is the philosophy that drives me. The thing that makes me into a politician, the things I actually want to achieve that underpin the detailed policies. I hope you found that interesting. There's much more I could have talked about, a Rawlsian approach and why inequality is bad from that perspective. But I hope you've got some sense of the things that fire me up, that make me want to continue working for the people of Cambridge. Thank you.
Marley, I just wanted to more fully address the inequality issue, so Jamala.
Yes, thank you for that question, John, and for the opportunity to just touch on that very quickly. I passionately believe in equality of opportunity, giving people the skills, the education, the resources to be able to better themselves. It's a little bizarre because with Buddhism we talk about contentment and being happy with what we have, yet you can see from my own qualifications I've had a very sort of ambitious view of where I can be in life. And I think it's been achieved by having equality of opportunity. I'm working with organisations such as Cambridge Ahead and Cambridge Area Partnership to be able to deliver those opportunities for people in Cambridge. So Cambridge Area Partnership is an organisation that looks at apprenticeships for youngsters